They laughed, not because he had committed a crime, not because he was weak. They laughed because, in that single moment, they believed his dignity had finally shattered. The Roman Forum was alive with voices. Merchants called out to passing crowds, soldiers marched through the streets, and senators exchanged guarded whispers beneath towering marble columns. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the center of the square, where one man stood alone, Marcus Aurelius. His face remained calm, but the atmosphere around him was anything but. A respected senator stepped forward, his voice echoing through the crowd. "So this is the man they call wise?" He sneered. "A philosopher dressed as an emperor. Tell me, Marcus, where is your wisdom now?" A ripple of laughter spread through the gathering. Another voice joined in. "Perhaps philosophy cannot save a man from embarrassment." The laughter grew louder. Some pointed, others shook their heads. Even a few of Marcus' own supporters lowered their eyes, unwilling to defend him. Marcus said nothing. His silence only encouraged them. Has the great Marcus Aurelius lost his words? Another man mocked. The crowd erupted again. To them, silence looked like defeat. But inside Marcus, another battle had already begun. His heart beat faster than anyone could see. The sting of humiliation reached deeper than the insults themselves. It was betrayal. Men who had once praised his character now sought applause by tearing him down. For a brief moment, anger whispered to him, "Answer them, expose them, humiliate them as they have humiliated you." The temptation was real. Marcus tightened his hand beneath the folds of his robe. No one noticed. Outwardly, he looked composed. Inwardly, he was wrestling with himself. He remembered something he had reflected on many times. Another person's opinion could wound his reputation, but only he could surrender his character. The laughter continued. Yet Marcus realized that the loudest noise in the square was not the crowd. It was his own mind. Would he allow another person's cruelty to decide who he became? Or would he remain faithful to the principles he claimed to live by? He slowly lifted his eyes. Instead of glaring at those who mocked him, he looked across the crowd. Some faces were laughing, others seemed uncertain. A young boy stood beside his father, watching silently. Marcus wondered what lesson the child would carry home that day. Would he remember a man who shouted back in anger, or a man who refused to let insults control his soul? Without saying a word, Marcus bowed his head slightly. Then he turned and began walking away. The laughter followed him through the streets of Rome. Each step echoed with the voices behind him. "Coward, pretender, your wisdom has failed you." Every insult landed like another stone thrown against his spirit. But he kept walking, not because the words didn't hurt. They did, more than anyone would ever know. As the city faded behind him, Marcus finally allowed himself a long, slow breath. There, away from the crowd, he admitted a truth few leaders ever confessed. "I am hurt, not by their words alone, but by how easily people abandon respect when humiliation becomes entertainment." He sat alone beneath the shade of an old olive tree outside the city walls. The afternoon breeze carried the distant sounds of Rome, but here there was only silence, the kind of silence that forces a person to confront themselves. Marcus closed his eyes. He could still hear the laughter. He could still see the faces. He could still feel the weight of public shame pressing against his heart. For the first time that day, he asked himself a difficult question. Am I suffering because of what happened, or because I cannot stop replaying it? The answer did not come immediately. Instead, another realization slowly emerged. The crowd had humiliated him for only a few minutes. But if he continued reliving those moments, he would become his own tormentor. The greatest prison is not built with stone. It is built inside the mind. Marcus opened his eyes and looked toward the horizon as the sun began to sink over Rome. He knew this story was far from over. The people believed they had witnessed the end of his dignity. They had no idea they had only witnessed the beginning of his greatest lesson. The next morning, Rome woke as it always had. Merchants opened their stalls. Blacksmiths struck glowing iron with rhythmic force. Children raced through narrow streets, laughing without a care. To the city, yesterday's humiliation had already become another story to gossip about. But for Marcus Aurelius, it lingered like a shadow. As he entered the palace, conversation stopped. Some servants looked away, others bowed with forced respect. Even among trusted advisors, he sensed hesitation. News of public humiliation spreads faster than news of quiet integrity. Marcus dismissed his attendants and walked alone into his study. The room was simple scrolls neatly arranged, a wooden desk, and a single oil lamp. There were no cheering crowds here, no critics, only silence. He sat down and stared at a blank scroll. His hand hovered over it before he began to write. If another man's words can destroy my peace, then my peace was never truly mine. He paused, The sentence was not meant for history. It was meant for himself. He knew something few people understood. The greatest battles are rarely fought with swords. They are fought in the hidden corners of the mind. For days, the insults returned uninvited. While meeting senators, he remembered their laughter. While hearing petitions, he remembered their mocking voices. Even in moments of rest, his mind replayed every word. He could have silenced his critics with authority. He was emperor. A single command could have ruined reputations. Another could have sent enemies into exile. Power made revenge easy. Character made restraint difficult. One evening, his closest friend entered quietly. "My emperor," the man said. "The people expect an answer. They say your silence proves the accusations were true." Marcus looked out the window toward the city. "What do you believe?" he asked. His friend hesitated. "I believe silence is often misunderstood." Marcus smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it is my task to teach them that not every unanswered insult deserves a reply." The friend frowned. "But won't they think they have won?" Marcus turned. "They have only won if they can persuade me to become like them." The room fell silent. Days became weeks. Instead of defending himself, Marcus focused on his responsibilities. He visited wounded soldiers. He listened patiently to poor citizens. He settled disputes fairly, even when no one praised him. His actions spoke where his voice remained quiet. Slowly, something unexpected began to happen. The same people who had laughed started noticing a strange consistency. Marcus never acted from bitterness, never sought revenge, never humiliated those who had humiliated him. His peace unsettled them more than any angry speech could have. One afternoon, Marcus crossed paths with the senator who had mocked him before the crowd. The man expected coldness, perhaps even punishment. Instead, Marcus greeted him with calm respect. The senator stood speechless. He had prepared arguments. He had prepared excuses. He had not prepared for kindness. As Marcus walked away, one of the senator's companions whispered, "Why didn't he punish you?" The senator watched Marcus disappear into the distance. "I don't know," he admitted, "but somehow I feel smaller than I did the day I mocked him." That night, Marcus stood beneath the stars. The memory of the laughter had not disappeared. Pain does not vanish overnight, but it no longer controlled him. He realized something profound. People often believe strength is the ability to strike back, yet the rarest strength is the ability to remain faithful to your principles when revenge is within reach. He looked toward the quiet city. The crowd had tried to define him with one humiliating moment, but a single moment could never define an entire life. Without realizing it, those who mocked him had given him an opportunity, not to prove them wrong, but to prove himself right. Little did Marcus know, the greatest test was still ahead. Soon, the very people who laughed the loudest would find themselves desperately hoping for the mercy of the man they had tried to destroy. Autumn settled over Rome. The golden warmth of summer faded, replaced by cold winds that swept through the city's narrow streets. Markets became quieter. Families hurried indoors before nightfall. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, something far more dangerous was beginning to unfold. A sickness spread across the empire. At first, only a few families were affected. Then entire neighborhoods fell silent. Soldiers returned from distant campaigns weakened by fever. Physicians worked day and night, but many could do little more than ease the suffering. Fear became Rome's newest ruler. The same people who had laughed in the Forum now stood in long lines outside temples praying for relief. Marcus Aurelius did not hide behind palace walls. Each morning, he visited hospitals, spoke with physicians, and walked among ordinary citizens. He listened to grieving mothers, comforted frightened children, and ordered food and medicine to be distributed wherever they were needed. Some advisors objected. "My emperor," one pleaded, "you risk your own life every time you leave the palace." Marcus answered quietly, "What value is a ruler who protects only himself?" Word spread quickly. The emperor who had once been mocked in public was now quietly serving the very people who had mocked him. Then came unexpected news. The senator who had humiliated Marcus in the Forum had lost nearly everything. His fortune had vanished after failed business dealings. Several of his closest allies abandoned him to protect their own reputations. To make matters worse, sickness entered his household. For the first time in years, the proud man found himself completely alone. He remembered the day he had laughed before the crowd. At the time, it had earned him applause. Now those same voices had disappeared. The applause had been temporary. The consequences remained. One rainy evening, there was a knock at the palace gates. The guards announced an unexpected visitor. It was the senator. His once elegant robes were worn. His shoulders, once proud and confident, were bent with exhaustion. When he entered the chamber, He could barely lift his eyes. Marcus recognized him immediately. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, the senator broke the silence. "I have rehearsed this conversation 100 times," he said softly. "None of the words seem worthy." Marcus waited. The older man swallowed hard. "The day I mocked you, I believed making you appear small would make me appear great." His voice trembled. "I was wrong." Marcus remained silent, not to punish him, but to give him space to speak honestly. Tears filled the senator's eyes. "I came expecting judgment. Instead, I found myself hoping for mercy." Marcus walked toward him slowly. The room was still. Even the guards seemed to hold their breath. This was the moment everyone would have understood revenge. One cruel sentence, one order, one act of humiliation returned. No one would have blamed him. Instead, Marcus placed a hand gently on the senator's shoulder. "We all fail," he said. "The question is not whether we fall, but who we become after we rise." The senator lowered his head. "I do not deserve your kindness," Marcus replied. "Kindness is not given because it is deserved. It is given because it is chosen." The word struck deeper than any punishment ever could. The man who had tried to disgrace Marcus now stood humbled not by revenge, but by compassion. As the senator left the palace that night, something remarkable happened. The guards, who had expected to witness justice through punishment, instead witnessed strength through forgiveness. In the days that followed, whispers spread through Rome once again. But this time, the whispers carried a different message. They laughed at him, yet he answered with dignity. They insulted him, yet he served them. They expected revenge, but he gave mercy. Marcus understood something that few ever learn. Victory is not found in defeating an enemy. It is found in refusing to let hatred reshape your own heart. Still, one final lesson remained. The entire city was about to discover that the greatest legacy a person leaves behind is not built by the applause they receive, but by the character they refuse to surrender. Winter arrived in Rome. The illness that had gripped the empire slowly began to loosen its hold. The markets filled once more. Children returned to the streets. The sound of laughter echoed through the city again, but this time, it carried a different meaning. The people had changed, or perhaps they had finally begun to see what had been there all along. One crisp morning, Marcus walked through the Forum, the very place where he had once been publicly humiliated. The marble columns stood unchanged. The merchants called out as they always had, but the atmosphere was different. Conversations faded as he passed, not because people feared him, because they respected him. Among the crowd stood the senator who had once mocked him. Before hundreds of spectators, their eyes met. This time, the senator lowered his head not from shame alone, but from genuine humility. Marcus returned the gesture with a quiet nod and continued walking. No bitterness, no triumph, no need to remind anyone of the past. The crowd watched in silence. An elderly merchant whispered to his grandson, "Do you know why they honor him now?" The boy shook his head. "Because anyone can answer an insult with another insult, but very few can answer hatred without becoming hateful." The words spread from person to person, not as an official decree, not as a speech, but as a lesson. In the weeks that followed, people spoke less about the day Marcus had been humiliated and more about what he had done afterward. They remembered how he continued serving the people, how he never abused his power, how he refused to let anger guide his decisions, how he chose character over applause. Years later, when young leaders asked Marcus what had been one of the hardest moments of his life, they expected him to mention wars, political struggles, or the burden of ruling an empire. Instead, he spoke of the day he stood before a laughing crowd. One student asked, "Did you ever forget what they did to you?" Marcus smiled gently. "No." The room grew quiet. "I remembered it," he continued. "Not so I could seek revenge, but so I would never become the kind of person who would do the same to someone else." The young men sat in thoughtful silence. That answer carried more wisdom than any punishment ever could. As the years passed, many of the people who had laughed that day were forgotten. Their names faded from memory. Their cruel words disappeared with time. But Marcus Aurelius was remembered, not because he never suffered, not because he was never humiliated, but because he refused to let suffering define his character. That is the quiet power of Stoicism. It does not promise a life without pain. It teaches us how to carry pain without letting it poison the soul. If someone has embarrassed you, if you've been mocked, betrayed, or underestimated, remember this. You cannot always control what people say about you. You cannot erase every injustice. You cannot stop every act of cruelty. but you can decide whether those moments shape you into someone bitter or someone stronger. The loudest people in the room are not always the strongest. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who walks away with peace still intact. Your dignity does not belong to the crowd. It belongs to the choices you make when no one is cheering. And perhaps that is why Marcus Aurelius never truly forgot what happened that day. Not because the humiliation mattered, but because it became the moment he proved to himself more than anyone else that character is worth more than reputation. Long after the laughter had faded, long after the voices had fallen silent, his actions continued to speak. And they still do. If this story inspired you, remember, the world may judge your worst moment, but it is your next decision that writes your legacy. Subscribe for more timeless stories inspired by Stoic philosophy, where ancient wisdom meets the challenges of modern life. Until next time, guard your mind, strengthen your character, and let your actions speak louder than your words.